The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate a quiet person. The rain fell steadily against the tall windows of the Sterling Room, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Inside, crystal glasses reflected warm golden light. Conversations floated softly above the sound of silverware and distant jazz. The room carried the familiar confidence of wealth. Expensive watches, tailored suits, business deals discussed over aged wine, and carefully prepared meals. At the center of it all sat Richard Sterling, 51 years old, billionaire, investor, public speaker, a man whose opinions often moved markets before newspapers had time to print them. Richard occupied a corner table with 3 business partners. The reservation staff always gave him the same seat. It offered the best view of the city skyline and enough privacy for important conversations. Not that Richard needed privacy. He enjoyed being noticed. His navy suit fit perfectly. A Swiss watch rested beneath the cuff of his shirt. Every movement seemed practiced, intentional, the kind of confidence that came from spending decades in rooms where people listened whenever you spoke. Tonight's meeting had gone well. A new acquisition was moving forward. Investors were pleased. Everyone around the table seemed relaxed. Everyone except Richard. He rarely relaxed. His attention drifted constantly across the restaurant, evaluating, observing, judging. One of his partners was describing a recent conference in New York when Richard's eyes shifted toward a server carrying a tray through the dining room. The young woman moved carefully between tables. Dark blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Black restaurant uniform. Calm posture. Focused expression. Nothing about her appearance seemed unusual. Yet Richard watched her for a second longer than necessary. "You are not listening," one of his partners said. Richard looked back at the table. "I am listening." "Then what did I just say?" Richard smiled faintly. "You said the conference speaker spent 40 minutes discussing market psychology and 20 minutes trying to sell a consulting package." The table laughed. "Fair enough," the partner admitted. Richard reached for his glass. Most experts spend more time selling expertise than demonstrating it. At that moment, the waitress approached their table. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was professional and composed. "Can I refresh any drinks?" Richard barely glanced up. "Sparkling water." She nodded. "Of course." As she filled the glass, another partner asked for coffee. Then another requested dessert menus. The waitress wrote everything down quickly, efficiently, without interruption. Richard noticed something unusual. She listened more than she spoke. Most servers try to be friendly. Some tried too hard. This one simply focused on the job. "Thank you," she said after finishing. Then she turned to leave. One of Richard's partners looked after her. "Good service." Richard shrugged. Competence should not be surprising. The partner laughed. "You really do expect perfection from everyone." "No," Richard replied. "Only from people who claim to be professionals." Several minutes later, the waitress returned carrying coffee and dessert menus. Richard happened to be explaining a recent economic trend, a topic he enjoyed discussing because few people challenged him. "The problem," he said confidently, "is that most people do not understand basic incentives." His partners nodded. Richard continued, "Human behavior is predictable if you understand the economics behind decision-making." As he spoke, the waitress carefully placed the coffee cups on the table. Richard glanced toward her and smiled slightly. Not a friendly smile, a dismissive one. The kind of smile that appeared when someone believed they occupied a higher position in the world. Then, loud enough for the table to hear, he said, "I suppose understanding economics is easier when you are discussing it than when you are carrying coffee." A few people chuckled politely, not because the joke was particularly funny, because Richard Sterling had told it. The waitress paused for less than a second, just long enough to show she had heard every word. Then she placed the final cup on the table. Her expression never changed. No embarrassment, no irritation, no attempt to defend herself. "Enjoy your evening," she said calmly. Then she walked away. Richard watched her disappear into the dining room. Something about her reaction felt unexpected. Most people laughed nervously. Some looked offended. Others rushed to prove something. She had done none of those things. Across the room, she continued serving tables as if nothing had happened. Richard took a sip of coffee, unaware that the quiet waitress he had just dismissed possessed a level of education that would soon change the entire conversation. The evening continued beneath the warm glow of chandelier light and the soft rhythm of rain against the windows. Richard Sterling's table remained the center of attention, not because anyone intended it to be, but because conversations seemed to orbit around him wherever he went. His reputation had a way of filling a room before his voice ever did. Across the restaurant, Hannah Brooks moved quietly from table to table. She refilled water glasses, delivered meals, answered questions from guests. The comment Richard had made earlier appeared to have no effect on her whatsoever, at least from the outside. One of the younger servers approached her near the service station. "Are you okay?" Hannah looked up from entering an order into the system. "Of course. That joke he made." Hannah smiled slightly. "I have heard worse." The server shook his head. Still, Hannah finished entering the order. People reveal more about themselves than they realize. The young server frowned. "What does that mean?" Hannah glanced toward Richard's table. "It means I am not worried." Several minutes later, she returned carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Richard and his partners were deep in discussion. Charts glowed on tablet screens. Financial projections occupied half the table. Numbers, forecasts, strategies, the language of investment. Hannah carefully refilled the cups. As she worked, one of Richard's partners sighed heavily. "The labor market data makes no sense." Richard leaned back in his chair. "It makes perfect sense." "Then explain it." Richard pointed toward a graph on the screen. "People respond to incentives. They always do." Another partner nodded. "That sounds simple." "Because it is." Richard took a sip of coffee. "Most economic problems are easier than academics pretend." The table laughed. Hannah remained focused on her work. Yet Richard noticed something. The slightest movement in her expression. Not disagreement. More like curiosity. "Do you have an opinion?" Richard asked suddenly. The table fell quiet. Hannah looked up. "Excuse me." Richard gestured toward the chart. "You seem interested." One of the partners chuckled. "Richard is recruiting economists from the wait staff now." More laughter followed. Hannah remained composed. "I am just serving coffee." Richard smiled. "Then answer a simple question." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Nearby diners continued eating, unaware that something unusual was beginning to unfold. "Do incentives explain everything?" Richard asked. Hannah considered the question. "No." Richard raised an eyebrow. "No, not everything." One partner leaned forward with interest. Richard folded his hands. "Why not?" Hannah glanced briefly at the chart, then at Richard. "Because people do not always optimize for money." The table became quieter. Richard smiled. "That sounds philosophical." "Not necessarily." Hannah's voice remained calm. "People optimize for security, belonging, meaning, status, predictability." One of the partners looked surprised. "That is actually true." Richard studied her carefully. "Most people would still call those incentives." Hannah nodded. "Some would." "Would you?" She paused briefly. "I would call them human." The answer lingered in the air. Not dramatic, not confrontational, simply thoughtful. Richard expected hesitation. Instead, he found precision. "Interesting," he said. Hannah smiled politely. "Anything else I can bring for the table?" Richard ignored the question. "Where did you learn that?" The partner beside him laughed. "Richard." But Richard continued looking directly at Hannah. "I am curious." Hannah adjusted the coffee pot in her hand. "From observation." Richard smiled again. The same confident smile. Yet now there was something else beneath it. Interest. Genuine interest. Observation. "Yes." That is a surprisingly sophisticated answer. Hannah simply nodded. "People are usually more complicated than spreadsheets." One of the partners nearly laughed into his coffee. Richard remained silent for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "most people avoid answering questions when they are unsure." Hannah met his gaze calmly. "And some people ask questions when they are already convinced they know the answer." The table fell completely silent. Not because the comment was rude, because it was accurate. Richard stared at her for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A real smile this time. Small, brief, but genuine. Hannah excused herself and walked away toward another table. Richard watched her disappear into the dining room. For the first time that evening, he was no longer wondering whether the waitress understood economics. He was beginning to wonder how much she understood that he did not. Richard Sterling spent the next 20 minutes pretending to focus on business. Pretending was the important word. His partners continued discussing acquisition strategies and quarterly projections, but a portion of his attention remained fixed elsewhere. Specifically, on the waitress who had just challenged one of his assumptions without ever sounding confrontational. That was unusual. Richard had built an entire career around reading people. Investors, executives, politicians, entrepreneurs. Most followed predictable patterns. Confidence often hid insecurity. Enthusiasm frequently concealed self-interest. Expertise was sometimes little more than rehearsed vocabulary. Yet Hannah Brooks did not seem to fit any pattern he recognized. She moved through the restaurant with the same quiet focus she had shown all evening. No attempt to attract attention. No effort to prove anything. The more Richard thought about it, the more irritating he found that. Not because she had embarrassed him. She had not. At least not yet. What bothered him was uncertainty. He disliked not understanding people. Across the table, one of his partners tapped a chart on a tablet screen. What do you think? Richard glanced at the graph. About what? 3 executives immediately laughed. You really were not listening. Richard smiled. Try me. The partner shook his head. We were discussing market concentration in the logistics sector. Richard answered the question effortlessly. Years of experience made that easy. Yet even while speaking, his eyes briefly drifted toward the dining room. One of the partners noticed. You keep looking over there. Richard took a sip of coffee. I am observing. The waitress. Richard shrugged. She gave an interesting answer. You mean the economics conversation? Richard nodded. Another executive laughed softly. Maybe she watches a lot of documentaries. The table chuckled. Richard did not. Maybe, but he did not sound convinced. Several minutes later, Hannah returned carrying fresh bread for the table. The conversation immediately paused. Richard noticed something else. She never interrupted discussions, never inserted herself into conversations. She simply performed her work with unusual precision. Most people became slightly nervous around wealth. Hannah seemed completely unaffected by it. As she placed the basket on the table, Richard spoke again. I have another question. One of his partners groaned dramatically. Leave the poor woman alone. Hannah smiled politely. It is fine. Richard folded his hands. Hypothetically, Hannah waited. Suppose a company offers a large financial incentive to improve employee retention. She nodded. All right. But retention does not improve. Richard leaned back. Why? The question sounded simple. It was not. Executives spent millions of dollars trying to answer versions of it every year. Hannah thought for a moment. Not long. Just enough to show she took the question seriously. Because money might not be the problem. Richard's expression remained neutral. Go on. People leave managers. She adjusted the bread basket slightly. People leave cultures. People leave environments where they feel invisible. One partner immediately looked interested. Another sat forward in his chair. Hannah continued. Higher pay can reduce dissatisfaction. She paused. It does not automatically create loyalty. The table became very quiet. Richard stared at her. That is a surprisingly sophisticated distinction. Hannah smiled lightly. Not really. Most executives struggle with it. Then perhaps they should spend more time talking to employees. One of Richard's partners laughed out loud. Richard almost did. Almost. Instead, he studied her carefully. Every answer felt strangely balanced. Intelligent without being arrogant. Precise without being rehearsed. You seem unusually interested in human behavior, he said. Hannah met his gaze. Everyone should be. Why? Her answer came immediately. Because every business problem eventually becomes a people problem. This time nobody laughed. Nobody spoke at all. Even the executives appeared caught off guard. Richard looked at the rain sliding down the windows behind her. Then back at Hannah. The conversation was no longer unfolding the way he intended. He had expected uncertainty. Perhaps a lucky answer or two. Instead, every question seemed to reveal another layer he had not anticipated. Hannah excused herself and moved toward another table waiting for service. Richard watched her leave once again. One of his partners finally broke the silence. Richard. What? You realize she is winning. Richard looked away from the dining room and back toward the table. Winning what? The executive smiled. Whatever game you think you are playing. For the first time all evening, Richard did not have an immediate answer. The rain continued falling beyond the tall windows of the Sterling room, turning the Chicago skyline into a watercolor of lights and reflections. Inside, the atmosphere had changed in a way few people fully recognized. What began as an ordinary business dinner was slowly becoming something else. Richard Sterling could feel it. His partners could feel it. Even a few nearby diners had begun paying attention whenever the waitress approached the billionaire's table. Not because voices were raised. Quite the opposite. The quietness itself had become interesting. Hannah Brooks moved through the dining room with the same composed rhythm she had shown all evening. She delivered entrees, cleared plates, refilled glasses. Yet every time she came near Richard's table, another unexpected conversation seemed to emerge. Richard hated admitting it, but he was curious now. Very curious. The woman clearly understood far more than she should according to the assumptions he had made when he first saw her carrying coffee. That realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. One of his partners leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You are still thinking about it." Richard looked up. "Thinking about what?" "The waitress." The table laughed. Richard rolled his eyes. "You are exaggerating." "Am I?" Another partner asked. "You have asked her more questions tonight than you have asked us." More laughter followed. Richard ignored them and reached for his water. Across the room, Hannah was speaking with an elderly couple seated near the fireplace. They smiled warmly as she helped them choose dessert. Nothing about the interaction seemed unusual, yet there was a certain ease in the way she communicated. She listened carefully, answered thoughtfully, never rushed, never performed. Richard noticed all of it. A few minutes later, Hannah returned carrying a tray with fresh coffee and dessert plates. The conversation at Richard's table had shifted toward investment risk. One executive was arguing that emotional decision-making remained the greatest weakness in financial markets. Richard disagreed. "Emotion is predictable," he said confidently. "That is why markets recover." The executive shook his head. "People are not predictable." Richard smiled. "Most people are." At that moment, Hannah placed a dessert plate in front of one of the guests. Richard looked up. "Would you agree with that?" Hannah paused. "With what?" "That most people are predictable." Several executives exchanged amused looks. "Here we go again." Hannah considered the question. "Predictable under what conditions?" Richard smiled immediately. "That sounds like a professor's answer." A few people laughed. Hannah simply waited. Richard continued. "Fine. Under normal conditions." Hannah adjusted a coffee cup slightly. "There are no normal conditions." The table became quiet. Richard leaned forward. "Explain." "Every decision happens inside a context." Hannah's voice remained calm. "Fear changes decisions. Security changes decisions. Relationships change decisions. Time pressure changes decisions." She looked toward the rain outside. "People often appear inconsistent because observers ignore the conditions around them." One executive slowly nodded. Richard noticed. So did everyone else. Hannah continued. "Predicting behavior becomes easier when you understand circumstances, not just incentives." Richard stared at her. The answer was not only intelligent. It was precise, structured, almost academic. One of his partners smiled. "That is actually a very strong point." Richard looked away briefly, then back toward Hannah. "You speak like someone who studies this." The comment escaped before he could stop it. Hannah smiled politely. "I enjoy learning." "That is not what I said." For the first time all evening, the slightest hint of amusement appeared in her eyes. "No," she admitted. "It is not." The table laughed softly. Richard found himself smiling despite himself. Something unexpected was happening. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer asking questions to expose ignorance. He was asking questions because he genuinely wanted answers. And that realization unsettled him. Because somewhere between the coffee, the rain, and the quiet confidence of a waitress who never seemed interested in impressing anyone, Richard Sterling had begun losing the advantage he thought he possessed from the moment he walked through the door. The evening moved deeper into the night. Rain continued tracing silver paths down the windows of the Sterling room, while conversations softened and tables gradually emptied. Yet one corner of the restaurant seemed more alive than ever. Richard Sterling's table no longer felt like the center of a business dinner. It felt like the center of a question nobody could fully answer. Who exactly was Hannah Brooks? Richard stared into his coffee while his partners continued discussing investments. He heard the words, mergers, expansion, forecasts, risk, but his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Across the room, Hannah was helping a family celebrate a birthday. A few minutes later, she was assisting an older couple with dessert. Then she was answering questions from a tourist visiting Chicago for the first time. Every interaction looked effortless, not because she was trying to impress anyone, because she genuinely seemed interested in people. One of Richard's partners noticed him watching again. "You are doing it." Richard looked up. "Doing what?" "Studying her." The table laughed. Richard shook his head. "I am observing." That is exactly what you said 30 minutes ago. More laughter followed. Richard ignored them. I am curious. About a waitress? Another executive asked. Richard glanced toward Hannah. About someone who keeps giving answers she should not have. One partner smiled. You sound offended. I am intrigued. The distinction mattered. At least to him. Several minutes later, Hannah returned to deliver dessert to the table. Richard noticed that everyone seemed unusually pleased to see her. Not because she was entertaining. Because she listened. It was a rare quality. One more question, Richard said as she placed a plate on the table. Hannah laughed softly. I was wondering how long it would take. The executive smiled. Even Richard did. This one is simple. They never are. Richard leaned forward slightly. Imagine two companies. Hannah waited. One pays employees significantly more. All right. The other pays less, but has stronger employee loyalty. Richard folded his hands. Which company wins over time? One executive immediately nodded. Good question. Another smiled. Now we will find out. Hannah looked toward the rain-covered windows for a moment. Then back at Richard. Neither. Several eyebrows rose. Richard smiled. That is not an answer. It is. Hannah remained calm. You are comparing outcomes without understanding causes. Richard studied her. Explain. Why does one company have loyalty? She asked. Why does the other need higher pay? The table grew quieter. Hannah continued. Sometimes compensation solves problems. She paused. Sometimes it hides them. One executive slowly nodded. Another stopped eating entirely. Richard noticed both reactions. Hannah pointed gently toward the tablet displaying charts and projections. Numbers tell you what happened. Her voice remained soft. People tell you why. Silence settled around the table. Even nearby diners seemed less noisy than before. Richard stared at her. There it was again. Another answer that sounded less like casual observation and more like someone trained to think at a very high level. You really enjoy this topic, he said. Hannah smiled. I enjoy people. That is not the same thing. For me it is. Richard leaned back. Something about the conversation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Most intelligent people he met wanted recognition. They wanted others to know how smart they were. Hannah seemed to want the opposite. Every answer was concise, measured, almost reluctant. She never volunteered information. She never tried to win. Yet somehow she kept doing exactly that. One of Richard's partners suddenly laughed. You realize what is happening, right? Richard looked toward him. What? The executive pointed toward Hannah. You keep asking questions designed to expose weaknesses. He smiled. And every answer exposes one of yours instead. The table erupted in laughter. Even Hannah smiled. Richard shook his head, though the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. For perhaps the first time in years, someone had entered a conversation with him carrying no agenda, no fear, and no desire to impress. And somewhere beneath the rain, the coffee, and the quiet elegance of the restaurant, Richard Sterling was beginning to suspect that the most educated person in the room might not be sitting at his table. The laughter around Richard Sterling's table gradually faded, but the observation remained. The most educated person in the room might not be sitting at the table. Richard tried to dismiss the thought, yet it lingered. Outside, the rain softened into a light mist that blurred the city lights beyond the glass. Inside, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm. Dessert plates were collected. Coffee cups were refilled. Conversations drifted through the room like quiet music. Hannah Brooks moved through it all with the same calm confidence she had displayed since the beginning of the evening. She never rushed, never lingered, never seemed interested in proving anything. Richard found that increasingly difficult to understand. Most intelligent people he encountered enjoyed demonstrating it. Hannah appeared determined to hide it. Nearly an hour had passed since their first conversation. The dinner meeting was technically over, yet nobody at the table seemed eager to leave. One of Richard's partners was describing a recent leadership seminar when an elderly man from another section of the restaurant slowly approached the table. He looked to be in his late 60s. Distinguished. Gray hair. Wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of person who carried quiet authority rather than visible status. As he passed Richard's table, his eyes briefly landed on Hannah, who was delivering a check to nearby guests. The man stopped walking. Completely. His expression changed instantly. Surprise. Then recognition. Hannah, he asked. Several heads turned. Hannah looked up. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise appeared on her face. Professor Whitaker? The older man smiled warmly. I cannot believe it. Richard immediately noticed the title. Professor. Hannah stepped closer. It has been a long time. The professor laughed softly. Not long enough for me to forget the most brilliant doctoral defense I ever attended. Silence spread across the nearby tables. Richard's partners exchanged confused looks. Hannah's expression shifted slightly. Not embarrassment. More like someone hoping a conversation would remain private. You are very kind, she said. I am being accurate. Professor Whitaker shook his head. Half the faculty still references your work. One of Richard's executives nearly choked on his coffee. Richard stared at Hannah. The restaurant suddenly felt much quieter. Your work? One partner asked. The professor turned toward the table. You know Hannah? Richard answered carefully. We have been having an interesting conversation. That does not surprise me. The professor smiled. She was one of the finest students our department ever produced. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Hannah looked as though she wished the floor might open beneath her. Professor, she said gently, I am working. Of course. The older man smiled. Apologetically. Then he looked toward Richard. If this young woman ever offers an opinion, I would recommend listening. With that, he wished everyone a good evening and returned to his table. The silence he left behind seemed even louder than his words. Richard looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at the check folder in her hand. One executive finally spoke. Doctoral defense. Another leaned forward. Faculty. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with suspicion, with realization. Pieces were beginning to connect. The structure of her answers. The precision of her reasoning. The way she separated assumptions from evidence. None of it had been accidental. Hannah, Richard said quietly. She met his gaze. Calm as ever. Yes. Richard studied her for a moment. Then asked the question everyone at the table was suddenly thinking. Exactly what did you study? For the first time that evening, Hannah did not answer immediately. And somehow that brief pause made the question feel far more important than any of the others. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The restaurant noise seemed to drift into the background as every person at Richard Sterling's table waited for Hannah's answer. Even the soft jazz music felt distant. Hannah stood quietly holding the check folder while rain traced faint lines down the glass behind her. The question itself was simple. Exactly what did you study? Yet everyone sensed that the answer would explain far more than a college degree. Hannah finally smiled. Not proudly, not reluctantly, simply politely. Behavioral economics, she said. The reaction was immediate. One executive nearly laughed in disbelief. Another sat back in his chair and stared at her. Richard's expression remained still, but his eyes changed. Behavioral economics. The very subject they had spent most of the evening discussing. The very field that explained incentives, decision-making, leadership, loyalty, and human behavior. The very topic on which Hannah had quietly corrected several assumptions without ever announcing who she was. You are serious, one executive said. Hannah nodded. Yes. Another executive leaned forward. You have a PhD in behavioral economics? I do. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation that had come before. Richard looked toward the empty chair where Professor Whitaker had been standing moments earlier. Suddenly, every answer Hannah had given throughout the evening made sense. The structure, the precision, the way she framed questions before conclusions. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been guesswork. Richard found himself replaying the first joke he had made when she arrived at the table. The memory felt significantly less amusing now. One of his partners broke the silence first. How do we not know this? Hannah smiled lightly. You did not ask. A few people laughed. Richard did not. He was remembering every assumption he had made from the moment he saw a black restaurant uniform and a coffee tray. Behavioral economics, Richard repeated quietly. What was your dissertation? Hannah hesitated for a moment. Not because she was unwilling to answer. Because she clearly disliked discussing herself. Decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. One executive blinked. That is your specialty? Part of it. Richard slowly shook his head. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. For 2 hours, he had been testing someone whose professional expertise overlapped directly with the subjects he considered himself knowledgeable about. And she had never once used that fact to gain an advantage. Why did you not say anything? Richard asked. Hannah looked genuinely puzzled. About what? Your doctorate. She glanced around the table. Nobody asked. Richard almost laughed. The answer was absurdly simple, which made it impossible to argue with. One executive smiled. You could have mentioned it after the first joke. Hannah's expression remained calm. Why? Because he was underestimating you. Hannah looked toward Richard, then back at the executive. That is not really my problem. The table became quiet again. Richard felt that sentence more than he expected. That is not really my problem. No anger. No resentment. No attempt to prove a point. Just simple truth. Hannah continued. People are free to make assumptions. She adjusted the check folder in her hand. Eventually reality does whatever reality does. One executive laughed softly. Another nodded in appreciation. Richard found himself smiling despite the discomfort of the moment. Not because he enjoyed being wrong. Because she had handled the situation with remarkable grace. Most people would have seized the opportunity. They would have corrected him publicly, revealed their credentials immediately, claimed victory. Hannah had done none of those things. She had simply answered questions. The realization landed harder than the revelation itself. It was not her education that impressed him most. It was the fact that she never seemed to need anyone's approval. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. Inside, the restaurant lights reflected across crystal glasses and polished wood. Richard looked at Hannah for several moments before speaking again. This time his voice carried none of the confidence from earlier in the evening. Only genuine curiosity. Then tell me something, he said quietly. If you have a doctorate in behavioral economics, what are you doing working as a waitress? And for the first time all night, every person at the table wanted to hear the answer. The question settled over the table with surprising weight. If you have a doctorate in behavioral economics, what are you doing working as a waitress? Nobody spoke. Even the executives who had spent the entire evening debating markets and strategy seemed genuinely interested now. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. The city lights beyond the windows appeared sharper, clearer. Inside, Hannah stood quietly holding the check folder. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look defensive. Yet for the first time all evening, she seemed to choose her words carefully. Richard watched her closely, not with the confidence of a man testing someone, with the curiosity of a man trying to understand them. Hannah finally smiled. That is the question everyone asks. One executive laughed softly. Because it is a fair question. It is. Hannah nodded. I just do not think it is the most important one. Richard leaned forward slightly. Then what is? Hannah looked around the restaurant. A couple near the windows were finishing dessert. A server was clearing a nearby table. Soft jazz continued drifting through the speakers. Ordinary people living ordinary moments. The more important question, she said, is why people assume the two things cannot exist together. Silence followed. Richard studied her face. Hannah continued. Education and service. She glanced toward the dining room. Knowledge and work. One executive nodded slowly. Another looked thoughtful. Richard remained silent. When I finished my doctorate, Hannah said, everyone expected a specific path. Academia, one executive asked. Probably. Hannah smiled. Research, consulting, teaching, speaking engagements. Richard noticed she listed them without excitement, as though she were describing someone else's life. And he asked, I tried some of them. What happened? Hannah thought for a moment. I learned something unexpected. Richard waited. The further I moved away from ordinary people, the less I understood them. The table became very quiet. Hannah looked toward the rain-speckled windows. Behavioral economics studies human decisions. She paused. But human beings do not live inside journals. No one interrupted. They live in restaurants, airports, hospitals, grocery stores, office buildings. Her voice remained calm. Every day, I meet dozens of people making decisions. Good ones, bad ones, emotional ones, irrational ones. She smiled lightly. The restaurant just happens to be a very interesting classroom. One executive laughed softly. That is actually brilliant. Hannah shrugged. It is practical. Richard found himself thinking about every conversation they had shared that evening. Every answer, every observation. Suddenly, they made even more sense. She was not speaking from theory alone. She was speaking from direct experience. So you chose this? Richard asked. Yes. Voluntarily. Hannah laughed. That question says a lot. Even Richard smiled. Fair point. Hannah folded her hands lightly around the check folder. People hear waitress and imagine failure. Her expression remained relaxed. I hear waitress and think employment. The simplicity of the statement landed harder than any complicated explanation could have. One executive slowly shook his head in admiration. Another stared into his coffee as though reconsidering something. Richard felt an unfamiliar discomfort. Not because Hannah had criticized him. She had not. Because she had quietly exposed an assumption he had carried for years without examining it. Status, titles, prestige. He had always believed they revealed something important about a person. Yet tonight the most insightful person in the room had spent the evening carrying coffee. Hannah glanced toward the kitchen entrance where another server was waiting for help. I should get back to work. Richard looked up immediately. One last thing. Hannah smiled. You have said that several times. A few people laughed. Richard nodded. Probably true. Then his expression grew more serious. Do you regret it? Hannah paused. Regret what? Not taking the path everyone expected. The restaurant seemed unusually quiet as she considered the question. Then she gave an answer so simple that nobody at the table would forget it. I would rather be respected for who I am than admired for a title. And for perhaps the first time that entire evening, Richard Sterling had absolutely nothing to say. For several long seconds, nobody at the table spoke. Hannah's answer remained suspended in the air like the final note of a song. I would rather be respected for who I am than admired for a title. The simplicity of it made it impossible to argue with. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The glass windows reflected the lights of downtown Chicago in long ribbons of gold and white. Inside, the Sterling room was beginning to settle into the final hour of the evening. A few guests prepared to leave. Servers quietly cleared tables. Somewhere in the distance, a coffee cup touched a saucer. Yet Richard Sterling barely noticed any of it. He found himself looking at Hannah differently now. Not because of the doctorate. Not because of the academic accomplishments. Those things were impressive, certainly. But they were not what stayed with him. What stayed with him was the realization that she had never once used them to elevate herself above anyone else. Throughout the entire evening, she had possessed information that would have immediately changed how every person in the room viewed her. Yet she had carried coffee, delivered meals, and answered questions without ever mentioning it. Richard thought about his own life. About boardrooms, conferences, interviews, entire industries built around titles and achievements. For decades, he had watched people introduce themselves through accomplishments before they introduced themselves as human beings. Hannah had done the opposite. One of the executives finally smiled. You know, he said, looking toward Richard, I think this is the first time I have ever seen you run out of questions. The table laughed softly. Even Richard smiled. That is probably true. Hannah laughed quietly as well. Then she glanced toward the kitchen where another employee was waving for assistance. I should get back to work. Richard nodded. Of course. She began to turn away. Then Richard spoke again. Hannah. She stopped and looked back. For the first time all evening, there was no challenge in his voice. No test. No attempt to prove anything. I owe you an apology. The table became silent once more. Hannah looked surprised. Richard folded his hands. When you first came to the table, I made assumptions. He paused. Several assumptions. Hannah listened quietly. I saw a uniform and decided I knew who you were. Richard shook his head slightly. That was my mistake. Nobody interrupted. Richard continued. The truth is that you have taught me more tonight than most consultants I have hired. A few executives laughed softly. Richard did not. He was completely serious. Hannah smiled gently. Everyone makes assumptions. That does not make them correct. Richard's voice remained calm. Or fair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hannah nodded once. Apology accepted. No drama. No lecture. No victory lap. Just grace. The same grace she had shown all evening. Richard smiled. Somehow that simple response felt more meaningful than any criticism would have. One of the executives signaled for the check. Hannah brought it over a few moments later. The meeting was finally ending. Chairs shifted. Jackets were collected. Phones disappeared into pockets. The night had reached its conclusion. Richard signed the receipt and placed the pen down. Then he looked toward Hannah one final time. Thank you. She smiled. For what? Richard glanced toward the rain-washed city beyond the windows. Then back at her. For reminding me that intelligence does not need an introduction. Hannah laughed softly. Neither does character. Richard nodded slowly. The word stayed with him. As he and his partners walked toward the exit, several employees wished them a good evening. The door opened. Cool night air entered the restaurant. Then Richard stepped outside and disappeared into the city lights. Back inside, Hannah returned to her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She cleared a table, refilled a glass of water, helped another guest. The same tasks she had been performing all evening. Yet somewhere in Chicago, a billionaire was leaving with a lesson he had not expected to learn. And inside the warm light of a restaurant, a waitress with a doctorate continued doing exactly what she had done from the beginning, being herself. Because the strongest kind of confidence is not the kind that announces its value. It is the kind that never needs to.